We'll give everyone 1 minute to kind of, hop in and everyone get settled into the webinar before we get things going. Thanks everyone for joining us. Feel free to, drop a note in the chat telling us where you're tuning in from. I know we have people, from various places, so we'd love to kind of hear more from where around the country or maybe even abroad you're checking in from. So. Right. Well, I think I'll get going and people can kind of keep joining us, as they come in during these introductory remarks. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing. To get settled in, like I said, if you're just joining us, I hope you'll drop a note in the chat telling us where you're from. I'm sure we have some DC wonks, as policy is our favorite thing in this town. But oh, great, we have California. We love to see that. We have people from the West Coast too. So I'm Allison Prang. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the National Press Club Journalism Institute in Washington, D.C. I know some of you might have attended our first briefing in this series with the Bipartisan Policy Center last week. If you did, love you for that. We thank you. For those of you who are joining an event with us, though, for the first time, we just want to give you a little bit of background on the Institute. So the Institute is the nonprofit arm of the National Press Club, which is in DC. And our focus is on supporting and training journalists with various programs like these. We do career office hours, we do sometimes more craft-centered workshops. It runs the gamut. And on behalf of the Institute and our colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we thank you for joining us for this informational look at the big, beautiful bill that became law in early July. The Institute's mission in particular is to power journalism in the public interest. So helping people build the skills and standards for journalists to do that work effectively and to earn the public's trust. Today's topic obviously could not be more relevant to our national discourse at the moment. And we hope this briefing and the others in this series, there are two more, will help journalists make sense of the law for their audiences. It goes without saying, and I'm sure our speakers will back me up on this, that there's going to be some wonkiness and lots of policy jargon in any 1,000-page bill, which is why we're hoping the staff from the BPC can help us make some sense of it. On that note, I want to just give a brief background bit on the BPC, who we are delighted to produce this briefing alongside. The BPC and its advocacy affiliate, BPC Action, are unique in their approach to addressing the nation's most pressing issues. As the only organization working across the full political spectrum on domestic issues, the BPC brings together diverse perspectives to craft data-driven, pragmatic policy solutions. BPC Action then works directly with legislators and other policymakers to turn those solutions into real change. Today's briefing is specifically focused on what the new law means for taxes and tax policy. If we have any tax reporter nerds out there, I know this is your Super Bowl. I'm sure Andrew and Shai will, agree. This is probably very fun for our tax policy passionate people. And like I said, it's the second of 4 briefings we're going to hold about the new law. The first one was kind of an overview that was off the record. Then we have this one and the last 2, which will take place next week and then the following week at the same day of the week, same time, are going to address what the new law means for housing and families, and then lastly, healthcare. So today's briefing and the 2 future ones will be recorded and shared and are all on the record. Please drop any questions you have in the chat box or the Q&A queue throughout, and we'll get to them in the time we've set aside at the end for questions. And now it's my honor to introduce our 2 accomplished guests. First, we have Shai Akamis, Vice President, Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Shai leads the BPC's work on a variety of economic issues, including fiscal policy, retirement and financial security, and tax policy. Akamis got his start at the BPC in 2010, staffing the Domenici-Rivlin Debt Reduction Task Force and assisting Jay Powell, now chairman of the Federal Reserve, in his nationally recognized work on the federal debt limit. Over the years, Akamis has also steered high-level BPC commissions in several policy areas and provided extensive assistance to federal policymakers and their staff on some of the most pressing policy questions of the day. And then we have Andrew Lautz, Director of Tax Policy for the BPC. Andrew is responsible for leading the BPC's federal tax policy portfolio. In this role, he conducts research, develops policy recommendations, and engages with lawmakers and stakeholders on a variety of tax issues, from the child tax credit, which I'm sure we'll hear about today, to international tax reform. His insights on tax policy have been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Bloomberg, among other major publications. Previously, he was the Director of Federal Policy for National Taxpayers Union and NTU Foundation. Shai and Andrew, thank you both so much for being here and sharing your expertise. And now I'll turn it over to you guys to get to the nuts and bolts of the briefing going.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. It's great to be with you here today. Thank you to the National Press Club Journalism Institute for hosting us. Just going to give you a quick bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center. In addition to what Allison said, I would only add that one of our major goals is to provide objective, evidence-based information for members of Congress, the media, and the public. So that's really the role that we're here to serve in today, is to help you all sort through this monstrous, or massive, I should say, piece of legislation. And it has got a ton of attention in the month after it was passed, and now we're in a little bit of a lull. But as we'll see today, a lot of these policies are taking effect over the coming months and years. And so as we get further and further along, people will be looking to you all and others for explanations as to why this is happening, what's happening, and what it means. I am going to start with just a few minutes of a very broad overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to dive into the real nitty-gritty details. As you'll see, and there are a few better in Washington on the details of tax policy than Andrew. And so we're looking forward to your questions. We're going to keep the remarks relatively brief so that we have more time to dive into the pieces that are most of interest to you. I want to make sure that we put this bill in the broader, or this legislation, the one big, beautiful bill, in the broader context. The US government has persistently taken in more, it has persistently spent more than it has taken in taxes over the years. And in the current federal fiscal year, which ends on September 30th, we are projected to take in $5.2 trillion in revenue and spend $7 trillion for a budget deficit of approximately $1.9 trillion. These are very large numbers, and we'll come back a little later to why that really matters. But you can't really look at the piece of legislation that just passed without that context. This graph shows that deficits were already projected to rise over the next 10 years to $2 trillion and eventually $2.5 trillion. And as you'll see on the subsequent slide in a second, that will be even worse after OBBB. The accumulation of these deficits over time is our national debt, which today stands at $37 trillion, or about $29.5 trillion in publicly held debt, which takes out the debt that we owe to ourselves. And this is unprecedented deficits that we're running in peacetime. There's no major wars, there's no recession, there's no crises. This is relatively good economic times, which is when we should be paying down the debt, or at least not adding to it. And in fact, we're running unprecedented deficits. Just a quarter century ago, we were running surpluses. And so there's a lot of reasons how we got to the place where we did today. There was the war on terror, there's the global financial crisis, there was followed by the Great Recession. There's lots of unpaid for spending that we've had over the years. There was the COVID pandemic and the response to that. And then, of course, what we're talking about today is unpaid for tax cuts. We saw those several times over the last 25 years, but most recently in 2017, and then with this legislation. So on this next slide, you'll see that this is what the figures look like after OBBB. And the changes are not enormous as you see them on this slide, but they are significant in the sense that we're moving in the wrong direction. We're already running very large deficits, and this is going to make it even more difficult to tackle that problem. We're talking about $400 to $500 billion a year in additional lost revenue, and only small changes in the scheme of things to federal government spending. I should note that these numbers do not include some of the other policies the administration has enacted over the last 6 months, because the Congressional Budget Office has not yet incorporated those into their projections. So things like tariffs and changes to immigration policy and the DOGE cuts that have been going into effect, none of these are going to dramatically change the landscape, but just to note that those are not incorporated here. So on this next slide, a little bit broader context, you can see that the vast majority of the revenue that we collect as a federal government comes from two sources. It's income taxes, individual income taxes, and payroll taxes. Revenues in total have run at around 17 or 18% of GDP over the years. That's gone a little bit higher in times where we are not running large budget deficits and a little bit lower depending on the economic conditions. Right now, we're towards the lower end of that range, and we are projected to be over the decade. And that's just not enough in the era that we are in, especially with the aging of the population and increasing costs for entitlement programs. So this chart shows you where that $5.2 trillion comes from. Most of it, as I mentioned, is in those individual income and payroll taxes. Payroll taxes is both for Social Security and Medicare. And then there's a few other smaller pieces, corporate income taxes and things like tariffs and estate taxes and others that fall into that final category. I should note that we have a tariff tracker that has been of significant interest recently, given all the changes in policy. And if you Google BPC tariff tracker, you can see our various analyses of those policies that have gone into effect. So far, we think that there's been about $70 billion more in tariff revenue this year than in recent years past, and about $130 billion total collected since January. So meaningful revenue, but nothing compared to the numbers that we're talking about here. And it's also very unclear what that revenue will look like moving forward as these tariff policies are changing by the day or the week. On the next slide, just a little reset here back to where we were before OBBB passed. We knew this was coming because the 2017 tax cuts that were passed under the first Trump administration set up a major cliff at the end of 2025 when many of those provisions were set to expire. And so what OBBB does is it extends the vast majority of those provisions, makes a few changes, and then adds some more tax cuts on top of that. And Andrew will talk in more detail. So there were the tax provisions. There was also the debt limit that was coming due at roughly the same time. The Bipartisan Policy Center does a lot of work on the federal debt limit. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, of course, there was the regular debates about annual discretionary spending that are contentious as always. So then if we fast forward to today, what this looks like is that those tax cuts have been permanently extended. So there is now no expiration for most of them, although some of the new policies in particular will have expiration dates. Andrew will get into that. The debt limit has been increased by $5 trillion, pushing off the next time the Congress will have to deal with that for quite some time. And they're now, Congress is working on the discretionary budget for fiscal year 2026, which starts on October 1st. So that's sort of the change in the landscape that we've had. And what has happened is that deficits have increased by, in total, upwards of $4 trillion. So in this next slide, and you can see the impact year by year of the changes in OBBB. The net here is the sum of a few different parts, as the chart shows you. So it's about $4.5 trillion of tax cuts over the 10-year period that is offset by about $1.5 trillion in spending cuts. A lot of those were, as you've seen in the headlines, and in fact probably reported on, were to Medicaid in particular, but other programs like food stamps and more received reductions. And then that's further added to the cost with about $300 billion in new spending for defense and border policy. So the net of all that is about $3.4 trillion. And then if you add interest on the debt onto that, you get the 4.1 estimate of the total cost of the bill over 10 years. What's also important to note here is that you'll see that the costs of the bill are front-loaded and the savings are back-loaded. So there are more tax cuts in the early years and more potential spending cuts in the later years. But as we've seen time and again in prior congressional efforts, a lot of those initial tax cuts that aren't permanent get extended, and a lot of those spending cuts that happen later never actually come to fruition. So if I was a betting man, I would estimate that the net result of these policies will actually be more than $4.1 trillion when all is said and done over the 10-year window. We don't know that. It's possible Congress will be more responsible in the future and pay for some of the extensions or changes to spending policy that they enact, but that has not been the case for both parties in the majority of instances. So I'll come back a little bit at the end and talk about why this all matters, the impact on the debt, and how it relates back to the people that read your all's reporting. But let me stop there for now and turn it over to Andrew to talk a little bit more about the details of the tax provisions in the bill and then we'll wrap it up in a little bit. So Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Shai. Yeah, that was a great broad overview. We're going to dive a little more specifically into the tax changes now. So I first want to talk about the difference between Trump's first major tax law, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and then this tax law, the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So on the individual side of the tax code, 2017 was really focused on kind of a classic Republican and even sometimes bipartisan mantra: lower the tax rates, broaden the tax base by reducing or reforming tax credits, deductions, exemptions. Simplification was also a major goal in 2017. How can we make the tax code simpler? And what the 2025 bill does, the 2025 law does, is largely extend the 2017 tax cuts. They keep the rates low, but they narrow the tax base by creating new deductions and carving new types of income out from taxation. These are some of the headline changes you've seen: no tax on tips, overtime, auto loan interest deduction, senior deduction. On the C corporate side, so the business side and C corporations, the primary focus in 2017 was lowering the rate, lowering the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That was a permanent change. The 2025 law does less for business than the 2017 law, but still focuses on allowing faster business deductions for certain types of investment, like research and development, machinery and equipment. For pass-through businesses, these are sole proprietors, LLCs, S corporations, business partnerships that aren't C corporations. Name of the game in 2017 was parity or equal footing with C corporations. 2025, it's mostly the status quo. International taxes, 2017, TCJA did a major overhaul of the US rules for taxing multinational companies' foreign profits. It was the biggest overhaul in decades. 2025, a bit more modest, with some longstanding technical fixes mixed in. And as Shai noted, the big fiscal picture in 2017, tax cuts were about 70 to 80% paid for themselves, or not paid for themselves, but 70 to 80% paid for with tax increases, primarily base broadeners. It was about a $1.5 trillion net cost on the 2017 law. In 2025, tax cuts are only about 20 to 25% paid for, and rather than being paid for with tax increases or base broadeners, they're primarily being paid for with spending cuts that leads to $3.4 trillion in higher deficits. I'm about to throw a number of big charts and dozens of tax policies at you. These are mostly meant to be an evergreen resource beyond this presentation. We're not going to go through every one. So let me just first say that to understand the major tax changes in OBBB, you mostly need to understand a few major moving pieces, which are covered in this slide here. The 12 largest changes, tax changes by federal budget impact, are listed on this slide, and they're demonstrated, their budget impact in the chart. 8 of the 12 changes listed here are just permanent extensions of 2017 tax cuts, things like lower individual tax rates, doubled standard deduction, double child tax credit. The 2017 tax cut extensions cost $3.9 trillion on net, or over 100% of the costs of the net cost of the entire bill. So that's, it's more than the One Big Beautiful Bill costs on net. Some of the headline measures, no tax on tips, overtime, actually cost a lot less on paper than even the 2017 extensions. For one example, no tax on tips, overtime, auto loan interest deduction, and senior deduction costs combined just 30% of the cost of just extending the double child tax credit. So that kind of gives you a sense of the scale here. Quick review of those 2017 tax changes, or just re-review. Lower tax rates across the board for individuals. Those were made permanent. Doubled standard deduction was not only extended, but expanded. So the standard deduction that about 90% of taxpayers take is even larger now. State and local tax deduction, or SALT, was obviously one of the major touch points this year. Previously, there was a $10,000 cap on SALT. Now there's a larger $40,000 cap, so people can deduct more of their state and local taxes. The child tax credit in 2017 went from $1,000 per child to $2,000 per child. Now it's going to be $2,200 per child, and it's going to grow with inflation in future years. That's kind of a new change. So, but largely status quo from 2017 to 2025 in terms of what's being extended. On the individual tax side, obviously OBBB goes above and beyond just extending the 2017 tax law. No tax on tips deduction, no tax on overtime deduction. One important thing I want to note for all of these new policies that are deductions is that if you're a single taxpayer making under $15,750 in 2025, or a married couple making under $31,500 in 2025, that's double that amount. You're not getting any additional marginal benefit out of these deductions because you're already paying nothing in federal income taxes. I think that's an important element the new deductions that sometimes gets missed in the debate. We kind of covered the business side, but most of the action in 2025 comes from accelerated tax deductions. So allowing businesses to typically businesses need to depreciate or amortize or spread out the cost of big investments over several years when they're writing it off their tax bill. OBBB generally accelerates those deductions to 1 year, the year of investment for big categories of business spending like research and development, machinery and equipment, and structures like factories, particularly for manufacturing facilities. And then on the pay for side, obviously, most of the ways that the tax cuts are being partially paid for is through spending cuts to Medicaid to SNAP. But there are hundreds of billions of dollars in tax changes on the pay for side, mostly from the Inflation Reduction Act, the 2022 Biden era law, rolling back some of those clean energy provisions. So when it comes to like what's next, I actually think there are a ton of interesting questions that some of you are all are already asking and will be trying to answer in the months ahead. How does the macroeconomy change in response to this law? How do taxpayers feel it, right? Do they actually feel the tax cuts when they file their taxes, both in 2026 and beyond? Do economic behaviors on things like tipping or working overtime, do those change? How does Treasury write regulations around some of these new provisions? How does the 2026 tax filing season go when it starts in January or February? Does it go good? Does it go bad? Is it a mixed bag? These are just some of the questions that we have in the months ahead and that we'll be planning to research and talk about and write about heading into 2026. But regardless of what happens, we are virtually guaranteed to be discussing this law for years. As Shai mentioned earlier, there's a December 31st, 2028 cliff for no tax on tips, overtime, senior deduction, auto loan interest deduction. Those all expire at the end of 2028. The larger SALT deduction expires at the end of 2029. So we are guaranteed to be back here, whoever controls Congress and the White House, discussing these provisions in 2028, 2029. And what I want to end on is just, I want to end on this graph here, which it really, OBBB is a culmination of history repeating itself. This is the fifth major tax cut in this century. The first four were Bush 2001, Bush 2003, Obama 2013, which was largely making permanent the Bush tax cuts with a couple of additions, and then Trump 2017, and now the fifth one is Trump 2025. And we are actually setting up to repeat history again in 2028, where we're facing expiring tax cuts, political pressure to extend them, and new tax cuts, all as part of that horse trading. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch. But the interesting thing about this debate, one of the interesting things, is that we're kind of repeating history once again. With that, I will turn it back to you to wrap things up, Shai.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a great overview. The only point that I'm going to add before we turn over for questions is just a little bit more. I think in the last few years, we have been able to crystallize both in the policy community and I think more broadly, members of Congress and in the media and the public, a little bit better why the increase in debt that we have seen over recent years and that is exacerbated by this legislation really matters, both for today and for the future of the country's economic well-being. And when we think about today, we think mostly about the impact that it has on interest rates. We've seen higher interest rates, which affect everything from mortgages to auto loans to student debt, all sorts of debt throughout the economy. Those are based on the 10-year Treasury rate. And those 10-year Treasury yields have been driven up in part by the fact that we have growing deficits that seem to go as far as the eye can see. And the longer we have that trend, the more upward pressure there will be on interest rates. That tends to slow the economy. It hurts consumers. It hurts businesses. We've also seen upticks in inflation. The current discussion is around tariffs, which is I would say, a parallel issue to the one we're talking about here, although it has an impact on revenue to the federal budget. But even in the aftermath of COVID, there was a lot of discussion about the spending that was done after that and the amounts that contributed to the inflation that we saw in the US over the last several years that consumers clearly did not like and that had an impact in the recent elections. So those are just some of the impacts that debt has on the economy and on consumers and businesses across the economy. When we think about the longer term, it could reach a point where it becomes truly unsustainable and the markets do not want to lend to us at affordable rates any longer. And that's when we get into the position of having to make extremely difficult choices overnight, policymakers being put in that position, which would not be good for anyone in the economy. It also puts us in a really bad position to respond to future crises. So if we had, God forbid, another type of COVID situation, or an overseas conflict, or a natural disaster, things like that. The fact that we have such high levels of debt impact our ability to respond to those types of crises, whether it's in reality because the markets won't permit us to borrow more at affordable rates, or just the perception by policymakers that we're racking up so much debt that we can't throw that much more money at the problem because we might encounter some type of situation like that with the markets. So both of those are bad. And if they are factoring into policymakers or elected leaders' responses to crises, that's not ideally how we should be confronting those types of situations. We should be confronting them based on the needs in the moment and reacting to the state of play on the ground. So with that, really appreciate you having us all here today, and we look forward to your questions.
Great. Well, I will, guys, feel free, attendees, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. I might, as we kind of wait for those to come in, I'll start with a couple of my own. And I think this maybe Shai goes off like your last points you were making kind of well. Is there anything we can learn from in 2017, how the economy, like inflation, interest rates, what have you, responded to the 2017 tax cuts law that maybe we could see a repeat of this time around? I'm just curious if there are any parallels there we can learn from history in any way as far as what to expect.
Andrew, you want to take a step?
I'll start and Shai, want you to jump in. The short answer, Allison, or the relatively short answer is it's hard to tell. There's 2017 there was so much economic noise in the years after that. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was enacted into law. You had President Trump pursuing his first round of tariffs in the months after TCJA was enacted into law. It was kind of reverse order this year, right? Trump did Liberation Day and the big tariff actions in the second term before the One Big Beautiful Bill became law. But he did that in the opposite order back in 2017, 2018. So you had tariffs kind of interfering with the economic outlook. And then, of course, the big one, 2020, just about 2 years and some change after TCJA was enacted into law, we had the pandemic, and that threw everything out of whack for several years, is still impacting the economy. There's some evidence that we've reviewed that indicates, businesses were responsive to some of the investment changes we've seen because of the international changes and the cuts to the corporate tax rate. We saw some American businesses that had previously been holding assets abroad bring them back home. That's generally good for U.S. economic growth. We saw some, evidence of after-tax incomes increasing. But as Shai noted, we've also seen, TCJA added to deficits and debts. So we've also seen, I think upward pressure on interest rates compared to a situation where, the 2017 tax law was never signed into law. You see upward pressure on interest rates. Shai, anything to add there?
No, I would agree with all that. I mean, I think it demonstrated both the positive and the negative impacts of a law that is unpaid for, but that can have stimulative effects on the economy. And so I think both of those were evident to the extent that the evidence was available and allowed given economic circumstances, and we would expect some similar effects this time, although Andrew may have mentioned this already, but interestingly, a lot of the corporate provisions in 2017 were made permanent. And so a lot of the pieces that people think were the most stimulative or not stimulative, but were the most beneficial for economic growth over the long run were already permanent policy, and some of the tax cuts that were extended here, yes, they'll be helpful for consumers in terms of their short-term household finances, but are not quite as conducive to larger growth.
Gotcha. So it sounds like it's a little apples to oranges in that way, maybe comparing the two. We have a question from the audience on the no tax on tips provision. Will that help tipped workers, do you guys think, in any meaningful way? Or what will the effects of that look like?
I'll let Andrew take this one, with the only exception is I've been thinking and we've been talking a lot about how this will impact the whole sort of tipped industry, and more broadly than just how it will help the workers, which is an important component of it. But I was at a restaurant the other day where they had a policy that they charged a mandatory for all customers 18% gratuity. And my guess is that will not count as a tip in the once the regulations are put forward on this provision of the law, because otherwise you could just have everybody have 100% gratuity on everything, and then sort of the workers get to count all. So I think there will need to be guardrails put around what counts as a tip and what counts as mandatory charges that are just being classified as a gratuity. But I think this shows, those kinds of policies are all going to be rethought once the Treasury puts out how the policy is being interpreted or administered. But Andrew, in terms of the impact on tipped workers, turn over to you.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. The policy will help some tipped workers in a meaningful way. A couple caveats are in order. Some of them Shai just provided. One I mentioned earlier is if you're in a married couple and you're a tipped worker and collectively you and your spouse make less than $31,500, no tax on tips or the tips deduction is actually not going to help you because you're already paying nothing in federal income taxes, right? Tipped workers are still going to have to pay full payroll taxes. In some states, they may, have to pay full state income taxes on that income. So for some workers, it won't provide meaningful relief. But for a lot of tipped workers, right, if you're above those thresholds, if you're above the standard deduction threshold and you're earning tipped income, you're going to benefit from this provision, getting to carve out up to $25,000 in tipped income from any federal income taxes is a meaningful benefit. It'll be hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars, depending on who the taxpayer is and what tax bracket they're in. So it will provide meaningful relief, just maybe not as much as some people think.
That's really helpful. We have another question. Does an increased deficit impact the federal government's capacity to respond to weather-related disasters like hurricanes and wildfires? And if so, what might that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say it absolutely does. Now, orders of magnitude are important here. I mean, a lot of natural disasters cost something on the order of single billions of dollars to respond to. And when we're talking about numbers like $4.1 trillion here, that's a different scale. So I don't think it means that we're not going to be able to spend a few $billion on the next wildfire or whatever might arise in the next few years. But if in terms of national disasters, crises, natural disasters that rise to the scale of COVID or things along those lines, those can often cost in the trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions or lots more. As we continue to rack up the debt, this consideration is going to weigh more on policymakers when they are considering urgent responses to those crises. And so there's the two elements that I mentioned before. There's the actual reaction or response of the markets to the need to borrow more, where there may not be a lot of people who want to buy our debt at the same rates that we're selling that we're auctioning them off for right now. And that means further interest rates. And it may also weigh independently from that on policymakers' willingness to spend a lot more money. So if we're talking about trillions of dollars, they might say, well, we just passed a tax package that was $4.1 trillion. We've already got $29.5 trillion in public debt. Can we really afford to add a few more trillion? What are the markets going to say about that? Or what is the in the moment market reaction look like as they're considering those policies? And that's really a poor position for us to be in as a country, because we should not be making those near-term urgent decisions around what our sustainability of our public finances is over the long run. And so that's really one of the reasons why we need to get our arms around this problem sooner rather than later, so we don't get into a position where the response to some crisis is dictated by those considerations.
Andrew, anything you want to add, or are you good on that one? Just want to give you a chance.
No, Shai described it perfectly. So.
Nice. Well, but kind of related, Shai, I want to go back to one of the things you said on the tipped workers. So you flicked that obviously we need to wait for IRS guidance on some of this stuff. And that was a huge facet of the Inflation Reduction Act, like companies waiting for the guidance, kind of helping, weigh in on the guidance. So how, I guess, as far as seeing the effects, is it going to be a little bit further out before we see the effects? Because we have to wait, for the federal government to come out with the details of how this is going to work. Can you just walk people through that a little bit? Or Andrew,
sure. Yeah, I'm happy to take it. So the next step in the regulatory process is that Treasury, by I believe October 2nd, maybe October 3rd, has to define the occupations that quote ordinarily and or customarily and regularly received tips before 2025. And this was a provision that lawmakers included to prevent, say, lawyers and doctors from deciding, guess what, I'm going to get tips now. So it's trying to kind of like back into this, so that this provision is targeted at the folks we all expect to benefit from it: waiters, waitresses, Uber drivers, bartenders. And so that's the next step in this process, and there will be some, I think, some lobbying and some regulatory action around that. There will be some interesting questions that arise out of that guidance. But I think we'll see what comes of that. But that's kind of the next step in the regulatory process, and then folks are not going to start feeling it. The folks who benefit from it are not going to start feeling the tax cut until 2026. And that's both for 2025, when they file their taxes in 2026, they'll get the first like big tax cut then, and then in subsequent years it's going to be built into tax withholding. So it's going to be a smaller tax cut but on each paycheck rather than one big tax cut when they file. And so in terms of economic behavior, whether consumers or businesses react in certain ways to this tips deduction being in law now, that could happen sooner, that could happen later, that could happen not at all. We might not see consumer behavior. I've seen anecdotal evidence, right? I've seen, and by anecdotal evidence, I mean, viral tweets of people saying like, oh, I'm not going to tip anymore, or I'm going to tip less because of this. We don't know if that's actually going to happen, right? And there'll be some interesting studies, I'm sure, in the years ahead on whether it is actually changing consumer behavior, but it's going to take us several months, if not several years, to determine those effects.
And kind of related, actually, going to the occupation element of that guidance you mentioned. We have a question from the audience. What was the deadline for that on the defining the occupations?
October 2nd is it, and that's not October 2nd, 2025 is not literally written into the law. It's 90 days after enactment. So the law was enacted July 4th, 2025, or was signed into law July 4th, 2025. We expect that guidance by October 2nd. There have been cases in the past where, Treasury or some regulatory agency has had a deadline and they missed that deadline. And, I don't think there are strong negative consequences for Treasury missing that deadline. It's not like, Congress is going to take them to court necessarily, but this is a high priority of President Trump and the Trump administration. So I would not be surprised if they are actively working on this guidance right now because they want to get it out there in time.
Gotcha. And presumably it's going to be some interest groups and associations saying we want, restaurant workers, we want X people to be included in those occupations, right? And then the government weighing in about, do we agree, do we not agree?
I think that's right, and of course, the federal government, Treasury, IRS, they have to follow the letter of the law that Congress passed in July, and they have to follow congressional intent, right? So if there's, and that's where you could have like interesting regulatory questions or interesting judicial questions if it rises to that level where did Congress intend for occupation XYZ to have access to this? Is there gray area there? For occupations like waiters, waitresses, bartenders, I see less gray area. I think the clear legislative intent, political intent is for those occupations to benefit, and those occupations very clearly, ordinarily, and regularly receive tips before 2025. So that I expect fewer surprises, but who knows? These are unknown unknowns. Like which or unknown knowns or known unknowns. I'm getting the Rumsfeld metaphor wrong, but these are things we don't know yet. And we'll it'll be interesting to see around October.
Andrew, I would just add very quickly that one concern that we have had around the no tax on tips policy is the different treatment that it gives for workers of the same income in parallel industries, perhaps. So if you have, a cook who is not getting paid through tips versus a waiter who is getting paid through tips. And so it does create a little bit of a divergence around the treatment through the tax code of workers who may be earning maybe in very similar economic positions, but one is getting a different advantage versus the other. And so it's worth considering that as these occupations are defined. And I'm sure that's something that is, being considered as they work through this. And it's not going to apply to everyone, but those types of similar orientations is going to be a challenge.
Interesting. That's really interesting. The known unknown thing. I feel like that bodes well for journalism. And we have a couple other questions that came in, which is great. You mentioned the child tax credit, but did the earned income tax credit get any treatment in the bill? Did it increase, decrease, or get cut?
No direct changes to the earned income tax credit in the law. There are some changes to other refundable tax credits. So the premium tax credit that was originally created under the Affordable Care Act, there are some eligibility new eligibility restrictions there, but EITC, no major changes.
No. And then we have another one from the audience. Can you explain a bit more what you said about some married couples not needing to pay taxes because they don't hit a certain threshold? What is that threshold?
Yeah, so federal income taxes, right? So not federal payroll taxes like Social Security, Medicare taxes, not state income taxes, but federal income taxes. Uh, Taxpayer will pay taxes through withholding typically throughout the year, but when you file your taxes, you have the option to either take the standard deduction or itemize your deductions, right? 90% of taxpayers take the standard deduction these days. It used to be 2/3, 1/3, but because the 2017 tax law doubled the standard deduction, made it a lot more generous. Now we have about 90% of taxpayers take the standard deduction. Under the One Big Beautiful Bill, the standard deduction in 2025 is $15,750 for single taxpayers and $31,500 for married couples, just double that amount for singles. And so if you're in a married couple and you have less than $31,500 in income and you take the standard deduction, that means that none of your income is subject to federal income taxes because the standard deduction is just a reduction in your taxable income. So if I have if I'm in a married couple, my income is $30,000 and I take the standard deduction, that goes all the way down. My taxable income goes all the way down to $0. I owe nothing in federal income taxes. I still owe federal payroll taxes, state income taxes, and the like.
And this goes back more broadly, Andrew, right? It's maybe not exactly apples to apples, but pretty close to apples to the broader statistic that I don't remember what the latest is, but approximately 50% of taxpayers do not actually owe any net federal income tax. So it might be 45 or something along those lines, but it's close to half, right?
It's a high number, and I'll also note, and we have, I have a little Excel spreadsheet I use to measure kind of like how taxes are changing in response to the new law. And there are going to be some situations, and this is rare, but there are going to be some situations where you have a household that's making, a married couple that's making $75,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year. If they have a couple of kids, 2, 3 kids, if they donate a little bit to charity, if one or both of them have tip income or overtime income, there's a situation where some taxpayers, some families making $75,000, $100,000 a year won't pay anything in federal income taxes as a result of stacking the various deductions. First, the standard deduction, then these other deductions like the tips and overtime deduction, charitable deduction, then the child tax credit. Like there are going to be some situations where taxpayers well up the income chain aren't paying anything in federal income taxes as a result of the various incentives and benefits in this law. Those are going to be rare cases, right? It's going to be a rare case where you have like enough tipped or overtime income and enough kids to like take you down to zero in federal income taxes when you're also making $100,000 a year. But there will be those quirky scenarios out there.
That was really interesting. That was a helpful like real life comparison. I always like to ask in these kinds of sessions, like, what do you guys see so far and what's been reported on the bill, by the media, people like us, about like what do you see that's been maybe wrong or misleading? Or I'm also curious if there's any tax element in the bill that hasn't gotten as much media attention as you think it deserves or as you were expecting.
Andrew, you want to go first?
Sure. Nothing springs to mind in terms of things folks have gotten wrong, and that kudos to national, local, and regional press for that. This is an enormously complicated law, and hopefully, selfish point to add, hopefully our resources have been helpful, because part of why we write our resources the way we do is to be a resource for reporters on some of these complicated changes. But I've been very impressed with the coverage thus far, and just folks really digging in on the many moving pieces here. One piece that I think has gotten two pieces I think that have actually gotten undercovered, and that I think we're going to be doing some more research on in the months ahead. One is the various changes to charitable giving under this tax law. Several things going on here. There's a new floor that you have to reach as either an individual or a company. You have to donate a certain percentage of your income in order to qualify for the charitable deduction. And so that's a new set of policies that are going to have impacts on charitable giving. In other ways, we're expanding charitable giving incentives. There's a permanent deduction for the first time for charitable deduction for people who don't itemize, and it's a small deduction, but could that incentivize charitable giving on the margins? I'm really interested, and I need to do some of my own research on like what is the nonprofit community, what is the charitable giving community saying about these changes and how they mix together. Does it come out net, positive for the charitable community, net negative in terms of the impact on charitable giving? That's unclear right now, but I think that's one undercovered element. I'd turn it to you, Shai, for anything to add, though.
No, that's a good one, Andrew. And I guess the other one, which I think has been covered a fair amount, but is pretty significant for a lot of folks, will be the additional standard deduction for seniors. I believe, Andrew, it ended up at $6,000 in the legislation.
Yep.
So that can be a significant tax cut. It was framed as no tax on Social Security. That's not exactly what the provision does. It's just an addition to it's an additional deduction that seniors can claim. But that will offset a good chunk of taxes that many seniors pay on Social Security benefits. But it will primarily help those, or it will exclusively help those that have a net tax liability. And a lot of lower, moderate income seniors already don't pay taxes on a lot of their income. Social Security benefits are only partially subject to taxes. So that will primarily help sort of upper middle income seniors on their tax bill.
That's really helpful. We have a question from the audience. Can you talk a bit about how OBBB will impact food stamps and Medicaid? I know we looked at this during the presentation, but any more granular we could go would be great.
Shai, you want to take a crack?
Sure. So with the caveat that we have other teams at PPC that focus on these programs, the changes to, and we do have some explainers on the site, I believe, about at least some of these pieces. So we can certainly, either Martina's putting some stuff in the chat, or we can share with you all afterward. But the changes to Medicaid, there's a few different components to that. It primarily revolves around eligibility for the program. And so there are provisions that deal with illegal immigrants eligibility, funding that goes to states that allow for that themselves fund or themselves cover illegal immigrants on the program. And so what the federal government will provide to those states relative to what they provide those states today, sort of to disincentivize states from covering those populations. There's also, I think the one that's probably gotten the most attention, it might be either the most or among the most significant, is the work requirements in the Medicaid provisions, which requires that either you have employment or some type of community service or be a learner. There's some parameters around this to qualify for the Medicaid program. And I think the impact that a lot of people are concerned about is not so much the people who are not qualifying for any of these, but the people who will not be able to prove that they are qualifying for these, because the hoops that you have to jump to in order to do that are often significant for families that have fairly low financial capability in many cases, households that have fairly low financial capability. And so the disconnect there can lead to people being kicked off the program unjustifiably. So there's one conversation around, should we have work requirements? And then another is, how do you actually implement a work requirement that doesn't end up leading to more people being kicked off than you actually intend? And then the last Medicaid provision that's gotten some attention is on these schemes that states have come up with to sort of increase the federal matching payments on the way that Medicaid is funded is a joint state federal partnership, and the federal government matches state payments. But states have come up with these schemes to increase their own payments so that the federal government will match more onto them, and then they sort of get a kickback in revenue from the way that these are funded. And there's limitations that have been put on these schemes over time that could impact states' abilities to fund their Medicaid programs. There's varying opinions on that. On food stamps, it's mostly well, there's a few changes, but one that's gotten a lot of attention is around the error rates in the program. And there's restrictions on the amount that the federal government will provide if states are not able to get their error rates in terms of making sure that the people who are eligible for the program are the ones that are receiving the aid are reduced over time. So those are a few of the spending cut provisions, but certainly would refer you to our website as well as other sources to to get more information on this.
That was great for a tax expert who, that's not your, who's not your, specific briefing. Kudos. I want to ask you, I'm glad you brought up states. I'm always curious, and this came up a little bit in the first briefing, but how are state and local governments going to be impacted by the changes to tax policy in this? Like, are they, going to have to scramble for funding in any way? Will they maybe have more, how do they fit into this ecosystem, if at all, and the new policies?
Happy to talk a little bit about the tax changes, and then Shai, if you have any additional thoughts there or macro thoughts on the spending cuts and how that may affect the states. So on the tax code, there are some interesting questions being risen around, and we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but no tax on tips and overtime, right? Most states, and this actually credit not our own research, but Jared Walzak at Tax Foundation and their state tax team does some great research on state tax policy. He wrote a report and found that only a handful of states, I think it's under 10 states, will automatically carve tips and overtime out from state taxation, like the federal government has just done for federal income taxation. The rest of the states, if they want to carve out tips and overtime, like the federal government has done, they need to do something. They need to pass a law at the state level, and so the technical term for this is conformity, right? How are states conforming to the tax code? Some of the stuff around, say the standard deduction or child tax credit for states that have their own, versions of child tax credit. States do have some automatic conformity to changes in the federal code, and so that will smooth over some of, for example, the permanent, 2017 extensions. You can largely expect some status quo there, but states will have to, will face some interesting questions around taxation of tips and overtime, around the senior deduction and how that plays in at the state level. It'll be interesting to see how states respond. And here's the thing: whether it's automatic conformity or not, it has an impact, because if it's automatic conformity, these are mostly tax cuts we're talking about here, and that affects state finances and state coffers if they are automatically cutting taxes, just like the federal government has done. And then if states aren't automatically cutting taxes, they've got to make a political and policy decision. They have to decide, are we going to conform to what the federal government just did? Are constituents demanding that we conform to the federal government? What's the political response to that? There are a lot of interesting questions, but Shai, anything to add there?
I just very quickly add on the spending side, I think that might even be more significant, and states are really trying to digest and grapple with what this is going to mean for their budgets over the coming years, because most of them, as many of you probably know, have balanced budget requirements. And so if there's going to be less federal resources coming in to fund Medicaid or food stamps, and they want to preserve those programs for the population that's receiving them, that means more money is going to have to go in from the state. And most states just don't have that kind of flexibility in their budget. And so what this is going to mean over time for their ability to fund, rural hospitals, food stamp program, other populations that are eligible for Medicaid in their states, there are real questions around that. And I think it's going to take many months, if not years, to sort that out. That's why there was a $50 billion, partly why a $50 billion provision ended up in the bill to help rural hospitals to try to offset some of these spending cuts and the impact on hospitals around the country in many of these states. But the general perception is that that's not going to be sufficient to offset the impact of the reductions. And so how do states grapple with that will be very interesting to see over time, and is work that we at BPC are going to be engaging in on our health program in partnership with the states to help them think about best practices for how to accommodate.
Was that specific provision, remind me, kind of done to get some more Republicans on board with the bill toward the end of things? Gotcha. Okay.
It was, and I think there was a lot of outcry amongst the healthcare community in terms of the effects that those cuts were going to have. And again, I don't think that if you think about how you distribute $50 billion across 50 different states and all sorts of hospital systems in those states, that money goes very quickly. And so I think there are questions as to how much of the impact it can offset. It will certainly offset some. But yes, it was to get those, in part to get those last votes in the final hours.
We have another question. Oh, the tipped income is a big topic people are into. Can you talk a bit about how the $25,000 deduction on tipped income will actually work? Do we have an idea of how the deduction will impact workers' tax returns?
Sure,
Andrew's
happy
ready.
to. Yeah, happy to dig into that a little bit. And I will note, it is we have talked a lot about no tax on tips in the last year. We obviously monitor our web traffic, and whenever we're talking about no tax on tips, it always gets a lot of attention. So it's there are going to continue to be a lot of questions around it. On the on how it'll actually work. So there's a little bit less friction in terms of employers reporting tips to the IRS, employers reporting to employees what they made in tips, workers reporting their tipped income on their tax return, and get claiming the tips deduction when they file their taxes. There's a little bit less friction there than there is for overtime because there's already a system in place at the IRS for reporting tipped income. There's going to have to be some changes to that system. IRS is going to have to issue guidance to employers, to workers on how they're tracking, how they're reporting. But tips, there's already a system in place. Where I've heard more questions is around overtime, because there isn't an existing reporting structure in place for either employers or employees. There's a transition rule for 2025 for both tips and overtime that it's I'm trying to do it justice in a short explanation. It basically allows a safe harbor of sorts for employers and workers to kind of produce their best estimate of tip and overtime income where there may be some reporting gaps, so that folks can still benefit from the deduction without without a reporting structure being in place yet. So there is a transition rule, and I expect Treasury and IRS to issue more guidance on what that transition rule looks like, how it operates in 2025, with hopefully a more formal structure for reporting in place in 2026 and beyond, once the IRS has some time and Treasury has some time to write some rules around this.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of time. We have a few more minutes. I might wrap it up with one last question. I'm curious, you guys, what's the appetite? We talked a lot about the deficit, what this means for the long term, the country's efforts to borrow long term, what this means for yields, et cetera. What do you think the appetite would be for another one of these bills in a few years? Do you think that is going to very much change the calculus? We've now seen two just in the last, less than decade. I'm curious what you guys think.
Well, it's funny you asked because there's already talk about a second reconciliation bill this year. I don't think most of us believe that that is likely to come to fruition, although it is being discussed already. It will be interesting to see how the next couple of years play out in terms of that answer, because a lot of this will depend both on the politics in terms of what happens in the next election cycle, what happens in terms of the markets and the economy and the debt, and how they're responding to this increase in debt. 2028, as Andrew pointed out in some of his slides, I think will be key. So a lot of these provisions, temporary provisions, expire at the end of the Trump administration in 2028. And so leading into that, where are these discussions at? How open will Democrats be, or how full-throated will Democrats be about wanting to extend some of those temporary provisions? Ironically, in a bill that passed with only Republican support, there may be provisions in there that Democrats are just as eager as Republicans to extend. And unfortunately, we've gotten into this cycle where both parties are all too eager to drive up deficits, whether it's through tax cuts or spending increases, and very little discussion in a bipartisan way of moving in the opposite direction of fiscal responsibility. Those are much more difficult decisions. So I think the appetite for more bills that cut taxes, extend tax cuts, that have a big price tag will depend in part on the politics, the election outcome, and in part on how the economic growth and deficit progress over the next couple years. Andrew, anything you'd add?
No, I think you covered it, Shai.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. To all of our attendees, thank you. This is fantastic. We had great questions. We so appreciate that. Like I said, I just want to make a plug, and I know these links have been shared in the chat, but we'd love if you guys could attend. We have 2 more of these sessions coming up. Like I said, same time next week, but the focus will be housing and families. So I assume we'll touch a little bit on the child tax credit, maybe in that as well. And then the week after that is going to be on healthcare. So for people who are interested in the Medicaid question that popped up here, that might be a great one for you guys to kind of zero in on. So let's see. I love how much information we packed into this and got into some very wonky tax info. You guys are all prepped for cocktail hour, especially in DC, to just, share your new knowledge. And we also, I believe this was already shared in the chat, but if you do have any follow-up questions for Andrew or Shai, Martina at BPC is a great contact to get in touch with both of them. I know as a journalist, I've also reached out to the BPC before for interviews. It can be helpful to break down topics. So yeah, and I think also we will share our link to donate if you really like the work the Journalism Institute is doing. We would love your support. It helps support future programs that we do. And thank you all again for being here. Stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye, guys.